Hello everyone, welcome to Lecture 2, where we will learn about basic effects, mediators, and moderators. This is the foundation of scientific thinking, and I'm giving credit to a paper from 1986 by Barron and Kenny in psychology, where this distinction was really laid out and discussed and has become a foundational concept in all of research methods. Today you will learn the definitions of a basic effect, a moderator, and a mediator. You will learn how to create complicated models that show moderation and mediation. You will gain practice applying these definitions to real-world problems, and you will gain practice in thinking about confounds. The most important foundational skill in all of research methods is extension of past knowledge. Have you ever heard the phrase standing on the shoulder of giants? It means that science builds on itself. The most basic discovery that science makes is what I am calling a basic effect. That is, any relationship between an IV and a DV. You can find a basic effect in a true experiment. Maybe it's a mean difference. You can also find a basic effect in a correlational study. Maybe that's a correlation. These are basic effects when you just, this IV is associated with this DV. That's a basic effect. And science doesn't just report basic effects. We build on those. Today we will play around with one very commonly used basic effect, and that is that ice cream sales are correlated with murder. This is a real effect. This is a real thing that folks found and have used in statistical lectures for years, just to describe interesting things and to have you think about as a scientist, how would you try to understand this effect a little bit better? And we're going to use it today to understand moderators and mediators. Why the relationship in the basic effect exists is the definition of a mediator. Ice cream sales could increase sugar consumption, and sugar consumption could cause murder, likely through other intervening processes. Ice cream sales could increase sugar addiction, and sugar addiction could be what causes murder through other intervening processes. Ice cream sales, maybe people are, have financial pressures at home because they eat too much ice cream, and this is leading to the murders. Maybe ice cream sales increase lactose intolerance, which may create some intervening processes that create the murders. While I only focus on one mediator per example, complicated causal chains are chains of mediators. So you could think like sugar intake. Well, I'll show you this in a second, but sugar intake could increase other things in the body, which can then increase the tendency to harm another human being. Ultimately, my goal with mediators is to understand why ice cream sales are associated with an increase in murder, and to even explore the idea, are these ice cream sales causing an increase in murder? Knowing why is knowing the mediator. Psychological theories and hypotheses use a common method of pictures to present a mediator. So here is that picture. So you put an arrow to indicate relationships. So ice cream sales are associated with murder. That's the arrow at the bottom. Ice cream sales are going to be associated with an increase in sugar intake. That's the arrow from the ice cream truck to sugar. And increased sugar intake is associated with murder, likely through other mediators. But this is how we model a single mediator. If you want to argue that the effect of ice cream sales on murder was mediated by sugar intake, your data should show all three of these relationships. Ice cream sales needs to be associated with murder, which we know. Ice cream sales needs to be associated with more sugar intake, which is common sense. But, what if people rub the ice cream on their faces and don't eat it, right? It seems like common sense, but we still have to measure it and show it. And finally, sugar intake has to be associated with an increase in violence or something that's associated with murders. For your own experiments, when you're testing a mediator, you would need to collect all this data directly. That is, you would want to collect data on sugar sales, you want to collect some data on murder, and some data on how eating sugar impacts one's body, or that it does. However, if you were reading literature trying to find out what to test, you can read across different articles and you can find evidences for all three pieces of this mediational relationship, for all three areas across different studies. And this is really important. This will help you make predictions about what a mediator is. And this is what you'll be doing in lab. Now, the study I am known for used this method. Now, I built my study on, racial bias in pain treatment, DeRicke et al. 2011, on 3 lines of evidence. That first line showed that race impacted the quality of pain treatment that Black people received compared to white people. So there was research from the medical world showing that race impacts the quality of pain treatment. Now, within social psychology, there was evidence showing that race impacted empathy. There was also evidence showing that empathy impacted helping, which is what I viewed medicine as. And when I dug deeper, I also found evidence showing that empathy impacts the quality of medical treatment that one receives. One of the most surprising examples I found of this, which I just bring up because it's interesting, was that David Raquel showed that empathy was the best treatment. Having an empathetic healthcare professional was the best treatment for the common cold. It was better than zinc and vitamin C and all these other things that are known to have some effect on treating the common cold and reducing its length, but empathy was its greatest. So if you read across the literature and you find different effects, like I found these different lines of research and put them together, I put it together in a paper that people have found relatively valuable. If you look it up, they've cited it, like other scientists have cited it 300 times, which is not the most that one could get, but it's quite a substantial amount of citations. So ultimately, I'm just teaching you, hey, this is a good way to break through and do good science. Mediational models are models for causation. There's a common phrase that very new and very basic methods thinkers like to chime in unison. Correlation is not causation. Now, this phrase has caused scientists across the different spectrums to dismiss correlational studies. However, it's also a really limited way to view science. Yes, of course, we can only show causation with an experiment in science, duh. But if you want to make a breakthrough and make a discovery, you need to think a little bit more complicatedly. For every correlation, there's a cause to be found. Now, to draw a conclusion of causality from a correlation, you need first to make sure that there is a correlation between the independent variable and the dependent variable. So in this case, ice cream sales are correlated with an increase in the murder rate. This is true. So check. The second thing you need to do is you need to examine reverse causality. So it could be like, examine reverse causality and examine logic of the temporal sequence. So first, it could be that ice cream causes changes in your body that make you more prone to violence and murder. That does make sense to some degree. We'd have to do some literature review and see if that's true, but from a logical standpoint, that could be the case. Now, in the reverse, one way to think about this is that, people who murder may really like ice cream, and it is the murders are happening first, and then the ice cream intake is happening second. Now, this second cause just sounds sort of ridiculous. It's actually kind of impossible, as each murderer would need to eat tons of ice cream to account for the increase in ice cream sales. So this reverse causality hypothesis is just illogical. Now, there is another one that could exist, and that is that if the murders are highly publicized and well known, maybe there's a serial killer that's stalking one's city, which has happened in my lifetime in various places, and it's been well publicized. There have been instances of serial killers being on the loose, and maybe people are eating ice cream to soothe the tensions of being exposed to these murders. But the reality is that this increase in murders isn't as highly publicized as you would expect. So even that reverse causality is kind of taken out a little bit because, murder in America and gun violence in America has become kind of commonplace and isn't even reported that much, which is sad but true. So I've ruled out 2 reverse causality hypotheses here, with just logic. However, logic isn't always enough. you often want to be completely sure. If you want to be completely sure, you can run some experiments. I have two that I suggested are on the screen right now. In experiment A, you give participants ice cream and give them a chance to aggress against others. This could be blasting them with sound, just harming them in some way that they don't actually harm somebody. We can do this ethically. We do study aggression in the lab. But if ice cream consumption increases aggression, you'd be able to argue that ice cream could possibly increase murders too. You would have that sort of argument handled. You could also run a quasi-experiment to examine if murderers do eat more ice cream than other folks. You could, if you had access to prison populations, you could have a group of folks that are convicted murderers who admit to having committed the crime. We do acknowledge our justice system has too spotty of a record for us to just go on convictions alone. And you give them a chance to eat as much ice cream as possible as they would like, maybe in an hour. You just kind of measure how much ice cream they eat. And you have a control group of people who are convicted of maybe a crime like car theft, who also admitted to doing it, and do the same. This would allow us to see, test. I know it sounds a little ridiculous, but, you can test any idea with an experiment. If we wanted to kind of test the hypothesis that isn't on here, that eating ice cream soothes us from the knowledge of murders, which I told you we don't really publicize those, so it's not the best argument, but we could see that one as well. You could have people that are, you could put people in a bad mood, give them ice cream, and see if that changes their mood in a nice little pre-post study like that. So experiments really allow us to, examine the logical temporal sequence. But what do I mean by that? It has to be logical. Ice cream changes the body changes aggression. That's logical, right? Murderers eat more ice cream, not logical. Eating ice cream could soothe one from knowing about murders, which is logical, but evidence doesn't really support that we publicize murders that much. People are very surprised by this effect when they hear it, and when they hear the true cause, which we will at the end of the lecture. So those are two things to think about. Number one, covariation or correlation. The IV is associated with the DV. Number two, logically, there has to be a temporal sequence that makes sense. So when we're talking about this whole mediational model, ice cream consumption has to do something to the body that then changes the ability to cause aggression, or murders, right, lead to an increase in ice cream consumption for a reason. Right? So we have to think about that. Based on this discussion, my logic has led me to say, it's probably ice cream changes the body, which changes the tendency to hurt somebody. However, real good science will test these ideas in experiments that I've just described. And then finally, you have to eliminate third variable confounds. Could something be causing both murder and ice cream consumption? Now, those of you that have been exposed to this, you know the answer. But those of you that haven't, think about it. I'm not going to make this an entry ticket because I know some of you know the answer, but think about it. Is there a confounding variable that could cause both an increase in the murder rate and an increase in ice cream sales? As we're psychologists, it's best to remember that for us, the best mediators explain internal psychological processes. All right? This mediator just says ice cream sales increase sugar intake, but it's not describing what's happening inside the human. So let's make this more complicated. So this is just the thinking process, the brainstorming process. But in order for me to really find the mediator, the effect of ice cream sales on murder could be mediated by sugar intake, right? And sugar intake is causing the murder. But the effect of sugar on murder is likely mediated by sugar in the blood or blood glucose level, right? The effect of blood glucose level on murder is mediated by activity in the brain, particularly in emotional centers of the brain like the amygdala, right? So the blood glucose increases activity in the amygdala, which leads to the murders. And specifically, as we are psychologists, that brain activity leads to psychological experience, in this case, frustration, anger, or aggression that is directly responsible for the murders in our perspective. Now, this is kind of an interesting argument. You can kind of see that we started with a social phenomenon, increase in ice cream sales in a community. An increase in sugar intake. What's that do to the body? Increase in glucose. What's that do to the brain? Increase in amygdala activity. What's that do to the experience of the human being, the thoughts, the feelings? It increases anger, and that anger could increase violence. So ultimately, this is a really complicated mediation model where every effect is mediated by the one on top of it. So the effect of ice cream on murder is mediated by sugar. The effect of sugar on murder is mediated by blood glucose level. The effect of blood glucose level on murder is mediated by amygdala activity, and the effect of amygdala activity on murder is mediated by the experience of anger. One of the things that annoys me as a psychologist is the way other scientists respond to me sometimes. I've been called a pseudoscientist and all these just really hurtful names. And I've heard that like other scientists experience this, and I sort of looked into it. And if you look at science, there is a hierarchy of scientific respect. And it sort of starts with physics, goes to chemistry, biology is next, then it's us, then sociology, then the arts and humanities, right? If you think about this, this kind of follows mediation. It requires atoms to make chemicals and compounds, which in turn are required to make cells, which in turn make people, which in turn make cultures, which in turn produce arts and humanities. Atoms are mediators of everything because everything is made of atoms, which is why many folks believe that physics is the only necessary science. Now, for certain, if we had such an advanced understanding of atoms, we could probably understand psychology from physics. But honestly, the science of psychology is much harder than the science of physics because our particles are not identical currently, right? A carbon atom is a carbon atom is a carbon atom. Very little variation, not like the variation of individual difference is. Also, there's a similar feeling that psychologists have that we're like maybe better or superior than sociology, right? As culture is just made up of people. But honestly, it's much harder to study the sum of all humans than individual humans themselves, right? Like there's things that happen when you put us all together, processes that are outside of the individual, and that is culture. Also, like I end with the humanities, right? That's because like if culture and people kind of, make art and culture and make all the products of culture, I'm just going to say it's extremely difficult to produce a top-notch work of art. A book that changes the world, and many of them exist. From like the Bible to the Motorcycle Diaries to, Harry Potter, right? That's not an easy task. Now, there's, I think about this as a college professor and like the majors my students take. Now, the one field I left out was business. And they are the ultimate mediator, as we would not be able to do any science without money. But I hope this helps you see how mediation is an important concept in the hierarchy of majors and in how we think about other folks that are just trying to understand the world, from just a different perspective. So I really am calling out everybody who disrespects psychology, but I'm also calling out psychology. We should respect the humanities and sociology. We're really just doing different methods. So there is no, in my opinion, hierarchy of science. There's just science. And there's not science. And not science isn't bad. It's just different. Moderators are another foundational concept of science. Essentially, a moderator tells us when an effect is weaker or stronger. It's not why the effect exists, it's when the effect exists. It's for whom the effect exists the strongest. Like, these are the two important ways to think about moderators. So here, I have a few just brainstormed examples. Ice cream sales are associated with more murder in America, but is going to be unassociated with murder in Ecuador. That's a moderator by nation. The effect of ice cream sales on murder is moderated by nation. Ice cream sales are associated with less murder of the wealthy, but more murder of people who are poor, right? Wealth is a moderator of the same effect. Ice cream sales are associated with more murders of men, but less murders of women and transgender people, right? This would be a moderator by gender. And maybe I'm wrong in this, so maybe that could go a different way based on how I said it just now. Ice cream sales are associated with more murders during the day, but unrelated to night, right? Time of day is the moderator, right? When does the murder happen? For whom does the murder more likely to happen? Yeah, those are moderators. When you model a moderator, you put an arrow pointing to the arrow of the basic effect. So here, for my first moderator, right, you can see the ice cream truck picture to the murder picture, and you have the arrow from nations pointing down to the other arrow. This is a symbol that shows wealth and those without money, right? To represent the wealth moderator, same thing. The gender moderator found this really cool symbol to represent different genders, all of the spectrum of genders. And you can see that arrow points to the arrow, and time of day, night or day, points to the arrow. So this is just important for our language, right? If we want to show a moderator in a model, we have to point to the arrow. Remember earlier when I said we have to think about the third variable problem? A third variable that can cause both ice cream sales and murder is heat. Heat is the third variable here. Other people have verified this. That causes both ice cream sales and murders. Specifically, we think that heat causes changes in our brain that make us feel angry and frustrated. This frustration causes us to murder. I'm sure it's more complicated. This effect is probably moderated by history as well as now when it gets hot, people sit inside with AC. But when I was a kid and when this effect was found, not many people had AC, and we would go out to malls, pools, and movies to cool down. But when you find a basic effect like ice cream leads to murder, you have to think about third variables that can cause both. And in this case, it's heat. Heat causes, frustration, which frustration can cause murder. Now, what you see here is a basic model of human psychology, where I start with the environment, all the way at my left. The environment is moderated. The effect of the environment on your brain is moderated by your personality, developmental stage, or age, which impacts your brain. So the basic effect there is the effect of the environment on the brain, but that is moderated by your personality at the bottom and your developmental age at the top. Your brain creates, subconscious and conscious thought, which form your mental experience. Your brain also alters your body. Your body and thoughts create your behavior, and our behavior alters our world. You can see some moderation in here, but also a lot of mediation. I also drew bidirectional arrows for a lot of things. I'm not saying this is right. This is an example of a blueprint of the human mind that one can construct with moderator and mediator modeling. If you see here, I put it together. I'm trying to make a blueprint for human behavior. Now I want you to do the same. Read the prompt and complete the entry ticket. Taking your knowledge of psychology, draw your own model of psychology using at least 5 predictors. Now, I want you to learn about research and join me in the most important process of being a scientist, thinking about that research and having your own ideas. So let me tell you about something. About 20 years ago when I was an undergrad, we were told, and there was strong evidence showing this, actually it was one paper, that showed that money does increase happiness, but it plateaus at about $40,000 a year, which is roughly $60,000 to $70,000 a year today. About 3 years ago, scientists redid this analysis and showed that money increases happiness, and it continues. It doesn't plateau. It keeps increasing happiness. And then last year, the 2 scientists that did these 2 studies got together, and they found that for most people, money increases happiness. But for people who are chronically sad, the effect of money on happiness plateaus at about that $60K mark. So for an entry ticket item, I'm going to ask, is one's sadness a moderator or mediator of the effect of money on happiness? And draw this model. For another entry ticket item number 3, ignore chronically sad people. I want you to just ignore the chronically sad people, right? They're the people who money does not increase happiness forever. Just ignore them, okay? Just non-chronically sad people. I want you to propose a mediator as to why money leads to happiness. Just one mediator, and draw that model. It just needs to be a word, but you need to draw the model. You can draw a picture. I like the pictures, but words work just fine. Now, for your fourth and final entry ticket item, I want you to draw an arrow model that represents this study, and I'm going to read it. Recent studies demonstrate that Republicans live longer than Democrats. Okay. So what's the DV and the IV are there? Okay. You've got to pull that out from that sentence. Do that now. We examined whether these longevity benefits are universal or culturally varying. Following a person culture match perspective, that is like in certain cultures, certain people do better, right? So in this case, if you're a Republican living in a Republican world, you're going to do better. If you're a Democrat living in a democratic society, you're going to do better. We hypothesize that Republicans' longevity benefits occur in Republican but not Democratic states. To test this argument, we conducted 2 studies among U.S. adults. I'm just going to pause right here. Once we get to the results, you'll see, but like this gives you the sort of basic foundation of this study. They've just added a moderator or a mediator right here. So now add that to your model. In pre-register study 1, we used large survey data. In confirmatory study 2, we analyzed obituaries, biographies of deceased U.S. political partisans. I'd love to see that method, but I don't know what they did. But I'd love to look in there and see how they did that, because it's kind of like an interesting way to do studies. Both studies supported the person culture match perspective. Okay, with substantial effect sizes. Effect sizes just mean that small, medium, large stuff. In Republican contexts, up to 50.1% of all Republicans, but only 36.3% of all Democrats reached an age of 80 years. Interesting, okay? That's very, very interesting. It also tells us, just in general, less than half of us are going to live to 80. Keep that in mind. That's Dr. D's sad brain. In Democratic context, there was no such longevity gap. Robustness tests showed that this effect generalizes to political ideology and holds across spatial levels, but is limited to persons with strong political convictions. Ooh, that last one, they added a new thing. It's limited to people with strong convictions. So the basic effect is described in sentence 1. In sentence 2, through basically the reporting up to the last sentence, they provide evidence for one moderator or mediator. So you got to figure out what that is. And for the final sentence, they added another moderator or mediator. Draw the model.